Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, KILROY Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's Window Company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, GREENBERG TRAURIG, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, Beechwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Friedman, LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, M&T Bank, MUSS Development, LLC, the Moynihan Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, W Financial Mortgage Fund, the Witkoff Group.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller. The big title, everything that's happening today is Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village. What's happening? Who knows what's going to happen? We're not here to discuss what happened in the past. We're here today to discuss what's going to happen in the future. But I don't have my crystal ball, so I've asked these four very intelligent individuals to provide their insight in what's going to happen with Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village. My guests include Jim Kuhn, the president of Newmark Knight Frank, Dan Garodnick, councilman of the city of New York and a resident of Stuytown, Stephen Witkoff, the president of the Witkoff organization, and last but definitely not least, a regular over here, Joseph Ficalora, the chairman, president, and CEO of New York Community Bank Corp. Joe, you have one of the largest loans where a bank has the loan on any property in New York City and probably in the country in Co-op Village. What do you see happening? I mean, I'm not here to say that Tishman Speyer made an error, which they probably did, and because everybody wanted it. It was the time that over there. What do you see as a banker? What do you see as a real estate leader and as somebody who's been involved with the Fed and everything else?
Well, Co-op City is not Stuyvesant Town. Co-op City is a co-op. The people there own the property.
I agree. The New York Community Bank is a leader in affordable multifamily rent-regulated apartments. So where do you see this? I mean, Stuytown is where Jimmy grew up. Jimmy's father and mother lived there. They were there 60 years. Dan's been there his entire lifetime. Steve probably wanted to buy it over the period of time. And you've probably been offered the financing on it. So where do you see what's going to happen?
Well, some of that's up in the air right now. Obviously, there'll be others who could talk about structures that might work. I think the important thing to recognize, though, is that right now, the most money that is at risk in Stuytown is, in fact, taxpayer money. Because Fannie and Freddie happen to, in fact, be bankrupt. And the only money available to cover their losses are taxpayer dollars. So there is always a winner and a loser in anything. In this particular case, the outstanding debt to the largest degree is held by the taxpayer. So whatever happens here.
With regard to that, and maybe someone else would even chime in with does Fannie and Freddie, which happens to be us, the taxpayers and the government, do they stay in later on if the property is converted to a cooperative? Do they remain?
They certainly can.
Would they? Well, I mean, what?
I don't know.
Michael, I think you need to take a step back for a second, though, because you asked the question, what's going to happen? I don't think any of us know what's going to happen.
Right.
I think we all have our opinions on what should happen. If you remember, some years ago, we converted to Lincoln Towers.
Which I think is important. Try to explain to my audience.
We bought the MacArthur Foundation portfolio, and Lincoln Towers was a big part of it. I think it was 4,000 units. And at the time, the tenants were very well organized because they expected it. They had no buy pledges signed, and we negotiated a deal with them where, in fact, it was a non-evict plan so that if you didn't buy the apartments, you were not forced to move out. You were still a rent-protected, rent-stabilized tenant. And we actually ended up selling 65% of the apartments. And I think that everybody has to understand today is you have a lot of emotion involved in what's going to be potentially a negotiation on price.
Didn't you have a motion at that time because Lincoln Towers was such a large
Yes,
unit?
it's the same.
It was 4,000 units. Stuyvesant is 11,400.
It's almost identical. It's almost an identical situation, a different time. The point being that a negotiation with a tenants association that has somewhat control is usually turns out to be a fair negotiation where the tenants end up with apartments well below what they could buy in the marketplace, and the landlord ends up with less than he would like, but hopefully enough to make a profit and cover the debt.
My question is, who's the landlord now? I mean, Marty Raines was the landlord when he bought the property. Today we have
the landlord. Today
we have somebody who's holding the keys.
Well,
we don't know who the landlord really is.
Ultimately,
Tishman Speyer gave back the keys.
Right, but ultimately, in terms of legality today, you'd have to say the landlord is going to be CW Capital, who is the special servicer for the debt group.
Agreed, but the special servicer doesn't care. They're getting fees.
That's not true, Michael. First of all, the special servicer has the B piece of the loan. They have a fiduciary obligation to the group. They do care, and I think CW is a very responsible special servicer.
They care to a point, but someone who owns it, a private operator, has a different care than CW.
But they're not going to own it forever.
I agree. So my question is, you live there. You live there. You're a tenant. You're probably a rent-stabilized tenant.
Now I'm a rent-stabilized tenant.
You weren't?
I was not, but I became one after the Court of Appeals ruled against.
You've been there for so many years. How had you?
Well, I grew up in a rent-stabilized apartment, and then I went off to college, law school, and all the rest. When I returned to Peter Cooper Village, I moved into what was then a market-rate apartment.
When did you move back?
2004. And for the subsequent years, I was a market-rate tenant until the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of tenants this past October, saying that all of those market-rate apartments were brought to the market illegally by Tishman Speyer and MetLife. So today, I am a rent-stabilized tenant, and all of the tenants are rent-stabilized.
How much has your rent gone down with the adjustment?
It hasn't been a significant amount, I can tell you that much. In fact, for a lot of people, the rents stayed the same. It was for a small percentage in which there was really any decrease at all. But the point of all of that was that all of this business strategy, the entire plan that was set forth in 2006, was based on the idea you could turn the apartments to the market as quickly as possible. Not only did we learn that that was not achievable, but it was also illegal. So to answer your question, though, going forward, how do you make sure who's going to be making the decisions here? Well, I think that you need to bring in a new owner. The new owner could be the Tenants Association, could be the Tenants Association partnered with a sponsor who wants to do the right things by that group in order to ensure the long-term affordability of that community. It's a symbol for middle-class people around the city. It's a symbol in New York City. To make sure that there's adequate maintenance and that you protect the historic configuration of that property. There's a real opportunity today to make something positive out of what is a very difficult and complicated situation.
At the time Stuyvesant Town was built, MetLife in the New York area did 3 projects. They did Stuyvesant Town, they did Parkchester in the Bronx, and they did Rivington in Harlem. Now, the keys are being given back on Rivington because too much financing on that property. Parkchester. What happened in Parkchester?
Harry Helmsley bought it and did a conversion with the tenants. To the tenants.
It's not a co-op.
Condominium.
So you're saying that's the private person, the private developer making a deal.
The only difference here is that I believe that in order to get something done in a reasonable amount of time, if you cut out the middleman, everybody has more to gain. So
who's the middleman?
The middleman is if you bring in a developer who needs to earn a profit. So in this particular situation, I sort of feel like we're past the point where if you want to make a deal where the lenders will come out whole, and I do believe the senior lenders can come out whole, and the tenants get a good deal together, I think that's the negotiation that needs to happen.
Now I'm going to ask the developer. You looked at this, and you were going to be part of the development group when you lost the bid. You were lucky. You didn't win the bid in 2006. You were part of that deal. Would you be the developer today? Why would you want to get into this hot potato, as one might say?
I think that this deal transaction requires what Dan, the type of developer Dan was talking about, somebody who is going to be involved, first of all, who is very substantial. Well, I'm not at that level. And somebody who has very altruistic motives with regard to this deal for all the reasons Dan talked about. Because I think that, I happen to agree, I think that this is going to be a tenant-oriented deal. That's how you're going to get Fannie and Freddie in line here. You know, the property has an appraised value, Mike, below the senior debt. So at the end of the day, everybody over Fannie and Freddie's level doesn't matter. You know, CW, in my opinion, is not going to have a lot to say, you know, in time.
All of the tranches and all the mezz debt and the other equity has been wiped out. Most people have said that. It's been wiped out. Where do you see this, Joe? Do you see a private developer, or do you see a tenants association?
Well, I think there's far more rationale for a tenants association to come in. But in this unique circumstance, the taxpayer is the biggest loser. So without looking back too far, we just need to look at the transfer of wealth here is from the hands of the people that invested in the deal, which you missed, but is now going to be to who?
Why do you assume the taxpayer is losing money? Because Fannie and Freddie are in the senior position. So why are you assuming they're not going to come out whole?
Well, the question is, depending on the structure, how will they be paid? And how much of what they've invested will they be paid? So if, let's say, they are $2 or $3 billion of what has already been identified as lost, in other words, no one is going to get paid $5.4 billion. And they will, in fact, lose the largest share of whatever is to be lost. So the question then becomes, will they, in fact, have the largest share of whatever is to be made? Now, if in fact, it goes to tenants, and tenants buy in and have all the rights of ownership, and then have the right of disposition at a gain, are the taxpayers taking the loss and the tenants taking the gain?
Well, I think the key here is to find an elegant solution that protects the interests of Fannie, Freddie, the senior debt here, and one that also recognizes and supports the interest of the 25,000 people who live there at the same time. You know, we realize that taxpayers have bailed out Fannie and Freddie now to the tune of $104 billion. I think the cap is up to $400 billion or more. And there are implications for us as taxpayers on both sides.
Right.
And so the key here is going to be finding a solution. We really want Fannie and Freddie to be active participants here because we believe that their charter mandates that they come and support tenant action like what we are trying to achieve here. And when they do, I think that there will be a solution that will make them whole and also protect the interests of the tenants.
I just want to go back and make one random point because I think it's important for all our listeners who are not sophisticated in the real estate industry. Because you made a comment that the court ruled that he raised rents illegally. I just think we need to define that it wasn't a landlord capriciously raising rents illegally. It was a system that was being monitored by HPD and HCR, where every landlord in New York believed, accordance with two government bodies, they were doing the correct thing. And it's unfortunate what happened. Who's to say right or wrong? But it wasn't the case of somebody illegally gouging rents. And that's important to go on the record.
That's right. I think that's an extremely important
Nor,
point.
Jimmy, does it really affect the economics. What affected the economics is the market. Because the fact is that all that happened is you got to bring an apartment to, you still get to bring the apartment to its maximum rental number that you can get in the marketplace today. It's just controlled and stabilized from that point forward.
I have a question. Let's say the tenants with a private developer or someone takes over the property. We had a question before, prior to the show, can a tenant in Lincoln Towers, a tenant bought a unit, and if they sold the unit, profit, whatever profit, in New York City under certain affordable new hop programs and some of the programs where the land was given away for $1 or other programs, the tenants who bought an affordable cooperative where there's an underlying, they have a certain amount of money they can make. Where do we see this in Stuytown? Is it a tenant who's been there for a long time? Do they get the opportunity, or are they capped on how much they should earn?
I think we have a really big difference of opinion here.
That's why I asked the question.
Right now, you could make the assumption this is a private deal going to be made, and the tenants are going to make what they're allowed to make. It really depends in the end on what the federal government has to do different than a private deal. If it was a simple private deal, the tenants should be able to make whatever they could make. We're in America.
But you have the federal government on the loan.
Right.
So since it's that way, in a way, it's like when you bought AmTrust. You took over. No, I mean, the government has an interest in the profitability. So why shouldn't the government have a profitability interest if a tenant sells a unit?
Well, I think there's no question here. The difference is that the United States government is already in this game, far more so economically than any of the tenants. The tenants have lived there for decades under very favorable terms. So the opportunity to have more favorable terms in making an investment is not necessarily consistent with the idea that they've already had favorable terms to live there for the last 2 decades or 3 decades or whatever. But I think the point that I want to make is immediately there is no question that the largest loser in what has happened here, the default on the property, is not Tishman, it's not the people that were the owners, it was the people that were the lenders. And the largest lender...
I mean, all of the lenders
right,
we're talking.
but the largest lender is the United States government, and the largest lender has already gone defunct, and the government on Christmas Eve said, we the people will stand behind on an unlimited basis. They didn't say we will cover $400 billion. You talk about TARP and you talk about all the other ways in which the government's obligating. They said we will stand by Fannie and Freddie on an unlimited basis, which means that all the losses which inherently are in their portfolios are the losses of the taxpayer. They don't make money.
So, Joe, why wouldn't you treat this similar to Goldman Sachs or any of the other recipients? Why couldn't the federal government get warrants so that the apartment house people could sell, the tenants could sell for profit?
I think that's what I brought up before.
And the government would have a warrant for a piece of the upside.
That makes sense. But leaving them out is the problem. Making sure that they're in, because the tenants have obviously an interest, but now so do the taxpayers.
Right.
And the taxpayers never took any benefit from this.
Joe, but that presumes that there are other buyers out there who are going to offer the federal government, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae. Let's assume, by the way, the property has a value at its appraised number today of $1.8 billion, with Fannie and Freddie debt of $2.1 billion. I happen to think that debt's dollar good, forgetting about appraisals, Dan, for a second. But a smart tenants association becomes the most viable bidder. I just don't believe that private developers are going to look to buy.
Steve, who's going to pay the shortfall right now when the rents are not sufficient?
But Mike, let me just finish the analysis. If I was buying, let's just assume that Fannie and Freddie would sell me their $2.1 billion, assuming I had that kind of money, which I don't. I go to Joe Ficalora, and he'd say to me, what's the net income? And based on that net income, I'll tell you what I'm going to finance here. Someone would probably have to write a check north of $1 billion.
Correct.
I
think that's a very good idea.
I don't know any private developer on the planet who's ever done something like that. So that's a non-starter.
There's a few out there that could, though.
Okay, I'm not saying there aren't. So now how do the tenants configure a deal? Well, and this is what we talked about before. To the extent you have a very coalesced tenants association and you can bring a large mass to buy, that's an immediate pay down. Now, maybe you do it in concert with a very well-heeled developer who writes another big check right alongside of them, and that becomes the most compelling deal to Fannie and Freddie. You know, if you were Fannie and Freddie here with that $2.1 billion mortgage, you'd sit there at your committee and you'd say, wow, that's the most compelling deal out there. I get the fastest amortization payment, and that's the most likely way that I'm going to get paid down in the quickest fashion.
But you want to talk about the maintenance payments, because what you really have to do is to make the government a partner and help the tenants, I believe, is that you need to get the Fannie and Freddie mortgages to be reduced to a number, and I'm not going to negotiate for either side, but
Right.
if they reduce it to say 4%, and now you have $120 million on 130 with 130 of income, and they get warrants in return, so that when the tenants sell their apartment and make this big profit, a piece of that's going to go back to pay down the debt, and that way the government is a partner with the tenants, and you don't need a landlord who, unless he's totally altruistic, is going to need to take that piece.
Well, you need a landlord for one thing, though. You need a landlord to stick the $500 million of deferred maintenance into this deal to make it right, to get it sellable. However, right, maybe you don't need a landlord for that. Maybe you go to Fannie and Freddie. And
put
Dan,
more money in?
No,
We've
hold on,
already
hold
lost
on.
money. Let's put
How
more
about
money.
just simple math. And Dan, what if Dan could deliver 50% of the tenants buying day one at, pick a number, $400 a square foot? You probably have, what, 800,000, right, 11,000
It's
apartments.
11,200 apartments, yeah.
At 600 on average, right? So at $400 a square foot, you'd have $1 billion for pay down.
Well, it's one.
If you were a lender, if you were Joe Ficalora and you were the lender here, he might say, you know what, in the face of that kind of payment, I might advance a new fresh $500 million to fix this
Wait a
property
second.
up.
Let's ask him.
Right? No, but I mean, no, but
since
Joe,
you're assuming what the lender, let's ask the lender.
but he's not the lender. I'm just saying, in theory, right? That's how lenders might respond.
I think
now you become the partner in effect.
Why it is so attractive to work on a deal with the tenants here, because they have the opportunity to infuse immediate capital into this transaction in a way that you need it. And
wait, where are they going to infuse?
They're going to buy.
they're going to buy their apartments. If they have the opportunity to buy apartments, and provided that it is done in a way which both gives them an opportunity to build equity in their own homes and also allows protection for Fannie and Freddie and those who need to be protected in this transaction, you have a home
you know
run.
what's going to be interesting? Many of the units will be financed by Fannie and Freddie because they'll get the 3.5% approval.
You're
Correct?
making the assumption that you have to put $500 million
Conceivable?
into this property, and you don't. Because when we did Lincoln Towers, it gave the tenants the opportunity to buy finished or unfinished apartments dependent on a price. And so all of a sudden, when the tenants become homeowners instead of renters, you would be surprised whether they would rather buy for a cheaper price without the apartment being fixed up.
We're talking also, though, Jimmy, about capital work, too. There's real capital work that has to be done.
Well, that's why you have a
here.
reserve fund in any co-op conversion.
Right. But
out of the proceeds of the sale, you're going to reserve 5-6% of the capital for a reserve fund, because any good co-op association is going to make sure they have a strong reserve fund when they negotiate their plan after the Attorney General comes back with comments.
As tenant, what is the Tenants Association? What's their thought today?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a very well organized group. When we were participants in 2006, there were about 75% of the tenants who signed no-buy agreements committing themselves to the Tenants Association. There's only one Tenants Association. There are thousands of members. They want to maximize the number of options that tenants have. They want to, for certain, keep rent-stabilized tenants protected and not create pressures on them to move out of their apartments, particularly if they are perfectly legal and legitimate, as most, if not all, are today. And they want to give people an opportunity, if it works here, to buy their apartments at a reasonable rate so that they can live there in peace and actually build some equity and find a way to finesse the situation here so you don't have a change in ownership every 3 to 5 years, so that you don't have a for-profit entity that is coming in trying to extract people out of their apartments. We've played that game already. We've been through that already. We don't want that anymore. And so the goals here are stability, affordability, and protecting the maintenance on the property.
Joe?
Well, that sounds extraordinarily reasonable. And if there were not massive losses being taken in front of this conversation, there would be no more to discuss. So had that been Mitchell-Lama and it was being turned over by the state to the co-op owners, such as Co-op City, the tenants, the co-op owners, own the entire complex. So we, in fact, provided a $480 million loan for that property to be improved for the benefit of the owners, the co-op owners. In this circumstance, however, we don't have co-op owners. You're talking about the possibility of creating co-op owners. But if we do that without recognition of who, in fact, is taking the big loss, which right now is the taxpayer, then we're leaving out an important component of how you've come to where you are. So, and this has nothing to do with the lawsuit. This has to do with what is the right redistribution of wealth, if you will. The economics in this particular complex have existed for decades. The long-term holder of this asset was MetLife. They ran the property well, as best as I know. They ran the property well to the benefit of all the tenants, and they were there for many decades. They were offered to sell at a very, very high price.
And they sold only because they went public. MetLife really subsidized this for many, many years. They they spent much more money than they had to.
Right.
And they kept the property company.
That's right. They were a great
had to
owner.
exercise their right to sell it.
That's right.
They
And they made a very
shareholders.
big profit
They had the right
in selling.
They had the right.
And the point that you made earlier, MetLife did not break the law. Neither did Tishman break the law. Unfortunately, the amicus brief that was filed by the city agency responsible for changing the rent in that complex was ignored. So the amicus brief...
I have to correct a couple of things. First of all, there was some conflicting authority coming out of DHCR as to what was proper and what was right. That should have been a flag, I think, for anybody involved here as to what was legal, what was not legal. As it turns out, the Court of Appeals said that you can't do it. It did not rule on retroactivity and other matters, but the question here is not was it legal. As it turns out, it was not legal.
I just want to ask one last question. Does the group believe that a private developer will get involved with the Tenants Association in this transaction?
I believe they will, because I believe that as a special servicer, they're going to feel that their fiduciary obligation is to get people who know how to run property in there fast.
But you can get a property manager.
Well, that's what they're going to do. They're going to get a property manager.
Okay, property. I'm saying, will the end product be an owner, an investor, and the Tenants Association?
No, I think it'll just be the Tenants Association.
Joe?
I'm not sure. I know that the Wilbur Ross Group and Lefrak are real players, and they conceivably could be relevant in this decision process.
Stevie?
I think it's not a player like that, my own opinion. Those are guys who need to make a lot of money because they're running public funds. No, I think if Dan does a good job here, he's got the most leverage. I think that paper is dollar good.
The only person who's a tenant sitting with us?
I would say that every interested party out there will do their best to wrap their arms around the Tenants Association and the tenant body, and we're going to do our best to ensure that there's an outcome that actually respects the goals that the tenants have set out.
And what we're going to do, and I'm going to ask all four of you to remember, because in a couple of months, I'm going to ask the group to come back where we can see what has happened and what's going to happen in the future. So I'd like to thank Jim Kuhn, Dan Gorodnick, Steve Witkoff, Joe Ficalora. Next week, we're going to be talking about affordable housing. See you next week.
Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, KILROY Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's Window Company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, GREENBERG TRAURIG, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Akron Gold Brothers, LLC, Briarwood Organization, Beechwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman & Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Friedman, LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, M&T Bank, MUSS Development, LLC, Des Moines Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, W Financial Mortgage Fund, the Witkoff Group.